Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming to our webinar at the Center for Jewish Studies. My name is Orit Avishai, and I'm professor of sociology at Fordham University and an affiliate of the center. I'm pleased to be hosting this webinar with two esteemed colleagues and dear friends, Dr. Tanya Zion-Waldoks of Hebrew University and Dr. Ronit Irshai of Bar-Ilan University. The event is co-sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies and the Haredi Research Group. First, I'd like to extend a few words of gratitude to thank Magda Teeter and Emmanuel Fiano, co-directors of the Center for Jewish Studies, and Siobhan Verlatza, our administrator, who all work tirelessly on behalf of the center and our faculty. I'd like to thank Fordham Special Events team and our program sponsors, including Henry Miller, Eileen Sudler, Daria Werthstein, the Knapp Family Foundation and Charlie Knapp, the Pickett Family Foundation, Eugene Spidler, Bruce Tarragan, and members of our advisory council who generously allow us to do the work that we do. Please note that this is a webinar and it is being recorded. So if you have to log out early or you would like to share the recording with someone, you will be able to do so. The chat has been disabled, but if you have questions, please do type them into the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of the screen, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So, to the event for today, it is titled Holy Rebellion or Religious Egoism, the Achievements of Religious Zionist Feminism and the Rabbinic Illiberal Backlash in Israel. The talk will center on Ronit and Tanya's book, which is titled Holy Rebellion, Religious Feminism in the Transformation of Judaism and Women's Rights in Israel, which was published a few months ago by Brandeis University Press. And just yesterday, we learned that the book won the 74th National Jewish Book Award in the Women's Studies category. So please join me in congratulating both authors. And if we were all in the same space, there would be loud clapping at this point. Holy Rebellion considers the achievements of the Orthodox feminist movement in Israel and the backlashes to it. The authors use the movement as a case study to think about many questions that are of concern not only to Jewish communities, but also to observers and students of other progressive religious movements. So we'll likely hear about multiculturalism, how to affect change from within a conservative religious tradition, and the intersection between religion and the state. The book is an intellectual tour de force, marching through Jewish texts, ancient and new, Supreme Court cases, several decades worth of research on Orthodox feminism. It also engages some key intellectual debates about feminism, Jewish orthodoxy, women's rights, illiberalism, multiculturalism, and so much more. So the event will unfold as follows. I will now introduce the speakers. They will provide us with a brief overview of the book, and then I will ask them a few questions and engage a discussion, and then open it up to the audience through that the questions that you will input into the Q&A function. Which is open, and feel free to do this throughout. Okay, so Dr. Ronit Irshai is an associate professor and former head of the Gender Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. She's a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute for Pluralistic Judaism in Jerusalem, a member of the board of Women's Rights Reckman Center at Bar-Ilan University, and a member of Kolech, a religious feminist forum in Israel. She has been a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School, a visiting scholar at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, and a visiting professor at Gindal Global University in India. Her work focuses on the judicial and theological intersections between Jewish law, halacha, and feminist and gender insights, and she's the author of numerous articles and book chapters on issues such as halacha, theology and gender, fertility and Jewish law, sexual injuries, halacha in Israel, and in Israeli rabbinical courts, Jewish religious feminism, feminist theologies, and LGBTQ people. Her previous book, Fertility and Jewish Law, was also published by Brandeis University Press. Dr. Tanya Zion-Waldoks is a tenured assistant professor at the Seymour Fox School of Education at Hebrew University, and she was previously a postdoc at Princeton University. Her work investigates intersections of gender, education, religion, and politics. She studies feminist activism for social change, gender equality in education, and anti-racist feminist activism in Israel. Her work has been published in top journals, and her current work on Haredi critical activism and civics leadership is supported by the Israeli Science Foundation. In addition to being a gender scholar, Tanya is also a feminist activist and mother of four, blending academic pursuits with social justice work. She has led national campaigns on LGBTQ rights, human trafficking, and social justice, and she's involved in egalitarian Jewish prayer communities, creative, innovative Jewish rituals. Since 2023, and particularly since October 7th, she has become a protest photographer capturing ongoing struggle for democracy, peace, and the return of the hostages. So one last note, as you can hear, as you've probably discerned from the bios, which I've shortened significantly so we can actually hear from them. Tanya and Ronit are not only researchers of the Orthodox women's movement, they're also a product of it, and more importantly, active participants in it. So they have skin in the game. And the book begins with a very, very moving preface in which they recount personal stories and their motivations for writing this book. So I hope we will get to hear a little bit more from you about how your personal experiences, identities as scholars and activists have influenced your methodology, multidisciplinary approach, and general inclination to engage in this work. And with this, I turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I will share the screen. Hopefully that will work. Can everyone see it now? Okay. So first of all, thank you so much. You opened with thanks, so we will also open with thanks. Thank you to Fordham and to the Haredi Research Group and to you, Orit, for hosting us. Thank you so much to Hadassah Brandeis Institute and the Brandeis University Press, which has seen us through thick and thin, working on this project for almost over 10 years as it develops, and haven't given up. And I think it's lovely to be able to meet today, which is a date we set long ago, not knowing that yesterday would be really a very festive and celebratory moment of winning this award, and hopefully we're worthy of it. Orit, you mentioned the personal standing or the personal skin we have in the game. So there's a picture here of two random women who we don't know, but we do open the preface with a conversation about women who are part of our familial legacies, our past and our present. Ronit's grandmother, who was, she never learned how to read and write, and had this deep, deep desire and devotion and wanting to take part in prayer and in ritual and in learning, and that was something that was denied of her. And we move all the way down to my daughters and how they discovered that in the world they are growing up in, so much change has happened that they can actually not just participate, but also lead. And I think that that is where we want to start this conversation, just saying we're going to try to make sense of some of these very complicated processes. And in this short part of this talk, before we get to the questions, we're just going to give a very, very brief overview of the main arguments and the main structure of the book. But really, it's important to keep in mind how much has changed in so little time. And part of what we say is that there's really this radical revolution happening in women's status within the Jewish world, specifically within the Orthodox world, even more specifically within the Religious Zionist Israeli world. And we're trying to make sense both of how much has changed and how it has changed. And part of what we do is also look at what backlash or what kinds of responses have come up due to the extreme success. And maybe at the end in the conversation, we can talk about where we are today and how many things have changed even just since we finished working on the book, and sort of where this is going next. So we'd like to start with the initial understanding that when we say we want to study religious Zionist feminism, the first response is usually, who are you even talking about? Because there is a sense that women must be either or. You can be either truly religious or either truly feminist. And that kind of critique means that these women's authenticity, their sense of belonging, their sense of faithfulness to the group is always in question. They don't count as properly feminist, they don't count as properly religious, and somewhere within that conflict is where they try to make sense of themselves. But this is not just a sociological question of who do you belong to, who are you really, are you authentic? It's also a theological question, meaning, is there place for critique within faith? Must you be faithful and trusting, and therefore you just accept things as they are? Or is there place for critique and asking questions? And recently, this is actually not in the book, but recently Ronit found this beautiful quote from the Maharal of Prague. I won't read it all, but basically what he says is, he says, you can't and you shouldn't silence questioning and opposition and critique from within religion. Actually, that in and of itself is not respectful to religion. We must see all these questions through, and we must encourage, and that is the essence of truth, being able to really encourage a critical debate. And I think that for us as academics who come from a critical tradition, and also who come from within this community and have a stand ourselves and how we want to see this world continue and how we want to see it develop, I think that question of what we do with our critique and can we also critique even religious feminism itself has been part of the question. So having said that, and understanding that even if you don't look like a feminist, or even if you don't look like a proper Orthodox Jew, you have to be careful because we often do disguise ourselves as human beings. I'll just give a very, very brief roadmap of what the book deals with, what is the case study and what isn't it. So in Israel, this could be a lecture on its own. Israel claims to be Jewish and democratic. As we know today, there should be a question mark after both. What does it mean to be Jewish and what does it mean to be democratic? There's always been a tension between those two values. And there's a very complex relationship between religion and state. There's definitely no separation, and the state controls many religious institutions, and many parts of citizens' lives are controlled by religious institutions. And when I say religious institutions, we have to be more exact. These are Orthodox run and Orthodox led, and therefore also very male biased. When we're talking about who the population that we've looked at, we have set aside ultra-orthodoxy. And so it's important to understand that we're not talking about the ultra-Orthodox community. We're actually talking about the modern Orthodox community, which is how in the American terms, that's what people use, but we're focusing even more specifically on the religious Zionism, which means this is a community which has a commitment to modernity, a commitment to being part of the broader secular world and incorporating these values and these practices in their daily lives. But they are also committed to a version of Judaism, which is very based on halakha, on Jewish law, and within that, in the Israeli context, there's also a nationalism component, which is very strong, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. One of the more interesting questions that we try to tackle in the book is, why do they do this, and how do they do this? And we'll just mention now that there's a feminist axiom that says that the master, Audre Lorde taught us that the master's tools can never dismantle the master's house. And so there's a deep suspicion about whether you can even use religious tools, particularly halachic legal tools, to dismantle, to question, to reform the structures of religion. And what we suggest and what our book suggests is that that can be done, but it is really a complicated process that sometimes looks more like evolution, even though it is revolutionary. And we term this tempered radicalism in the sense that it is very radical in its demand for change and its vision of different and really uproot some of the basic values and structures. And yet it is tempered in the sense that it also has a commitment to continuity and a commitment to keeping the structures and keeping the identity and belonging. And the question of when is something that we'll talk about a little bit at the end, saying, you know, what's happening at this moment specifically, and what have we seen over time. So that's enough of a background. I'll just say that the theoretical model that we work with, one of many, but the overarching theoretical model talks about nomos and narrative in very simple terms. We think about the relationship between culture and law, and that's part of the beauty or the joy of this project for us has been that Ronit's, really her home discipline is learning text study and critique of halakha and theology, and coming through that aspect. And where I feel more comfortable is the sociology and looking at the culture and looking at the society. And when we bring those two together, it allows us to look at how changes have happened in a interactive interplay between changes in law and changes in culture. So we want to look at both what's happening on the practical legal institutions, the formal rules, the social conventions, and the narratives, the culture, the beliefs, the values. So one of the first things we do in the book is figure out what are the main gendered critiques, right? Or the feminist critiques that Jewish feminists, and specifically Orthodox feminists, but certainly not only, right? The Orthodox feminism has come from a long tradition of, and has been affected and enabled in many ways by Jewish feminism in other more liberal denominations. So what are the critiques that they lob towards the Orthodox or Jewish nomos and the narrative? So we'll start with the narrative. Within the Jewish narrative, there's a critique of the absence of women's voices. Even when women's voices are there, they are often imagined or spoken, right, not by women themselves, but of women or about women. And there's a sense of gender essentialism and identification of women with the material. And it's not just the image of women or the image of the feminine, it's also the image of God and the kind of theology that inspires the Jewish world. Monotheism, the masculine image of God, and what that means about the relationship between God and man. I specifically use the word man in this context, right? And then what that means about the relationship between God and man, and then underneath that, women, and what that relationship looks like and how much it's power-laden. And the basic questions about the eternity of God's word. Again, if we go back to the question of critique, do we believe that God's word can change as society itself changes? So that's just sort of a very quick overview of the critiques on the narrative level. But of course, there are also critiques on the normative level, on what is it that Jews do and how what Jews do in terms of the social conventions and in terms of the legal norms, how does that affect women specifically and gender more broadly? So a lot of the critiques have to do with marriage and divorce rights, which has really always been one of the flagship issues. The basic banning of women from Torah study, which is not just the ability to passively learn, it's also about being able to create knowledge and reach positions of authority. The exclusion of women from certain commandments, time-bound commandments, and also from being counted as part of the public, and the implications of that, where when you ask who is a Jew, the proper Jew is the full Jew is necessarily a man, and who counts within the Jewish community is necessarily a man. What does that do to the reality of women's lives as part of this community? And then normative constructions of the female body and sexuality, not in this case in terms of the narrative of how we imagine it, but what that actually means in terms of the kinds of laws and norms that are then imposed on women, sexuality, fertility. At the end of this list, we put heteronormativity, which we think is a very important part, but it's always important to sort of put a little star or an asterisk there saying, yes, there definitely is gendered critiques of, or feminist critiques of how deeply heteronormativity is part of the Jewish and Orthodox ethos and its norms. Although this does not mean that every Orthodox feminist or every religious Zionist feminist will have a problem with each one of these things, certainly not with this last one. So it's a list that allows us to understand the broader critiques. It's not a, if you believe in all these things, then you are considered a religious Zionist feminist. The second part of the book, and I will not detail most of it, I will just give you an overview. The second part of the book really says, okay, so what has happened on the ground? Given these general critiques, which are sociological and cultural and theological and legal, what does this mean on the ground, and how have changes happened on the ground? And instead of detailing all of them now, which we want to encourage you to read the book, we'll just say that I think that the most important argument or conceptualization that we do here is saying these are not random changes that have happened in this field, in that field. They can be conceptualized as a basic demand for citizenship, for belonging, for participation, for having a say within them. So if we go back to the master's home, the master's house, it's reimagining this house as our house and renewing orthodoxy from within. if you will, demanding citizenship in these collective homes, but also reforming what these collective homes look like. And we look at very specific struggles and how they've developed and the achievements that have come about and how they came about within the home, the Beit Midrash, the hall of study, and everything that has to do with women being able to study and then become rabbis and even become legal advocates or legal arbiters. The Beit Knesset, the home of the prayer, so the whole area of rituals and synagogue. The Beit Din, the home of the law. So this has to do with mostly with marriage and divorce rights, but personal law within the rabbinic courts. The Beit HaLeumi, the national home. So we look at, for example, one of the examples is religious women joining the army despite rabbis not wanting them to. And then the whole area of the Beit, the personal home, the domestic, the family, the body, sexuality, marriage, relationships, and sexuality. So the next thing we're going to do is move to chapter 3, which is Ronit. So take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Tanya. So after all those amazing achievements in the last 30, 40 years in those 6 homes that Tanya described, we also see within the discourse some theological narratives or obstacles that religious feminists actually need to deal with and deeply do that. Because if we won't do that, we can achieve many things, but they can go back and deteriorate again. So the first obstacle that we identify within the discourse is what we term as Akedah theology. Akedah is the sacrificial imperative, and of course we have a lot to say about that, but what we want to explain here is that religious people can see the connection between morality and religion, at least in 2 different ways. In one way, there is no connection between morality, human morality, and God decrees, and what, the commandments or what God says, which is the morality. This is the morality. Morality has no autonomous status according to this worldview. If God would have said, I don't know, you should murder, so murder would be morality. I go to the extreme example, of course, but just to make the point. So these people believe that morality has no autonomous status, and of course, if there are things within the Jewish tradition or within the religious tradition that seems to be immoral, if you are a truly religious person or if you're a truly religious woman, you should obey God's commandment without asking questions about morality. And since we understand feminism to be a moral claim about the world, so obviously religious feminists cannot live in peace with this kind of worldview. But there is another possibility. There is a possibility to say that morality has an autonomous status. However, God wants us to be moral, and He commands on that. However, it might be that sometimes in extreme cases there would be a conflict. Usually, it won't be a conflict, and morality and religious commandments will go hand with hand. But sometimes, in extreme cases, it might be that there will be a conflict. And when it's going to be a conflict between God's commandments and human morality, of course, again, if you're a truly religious person, you should obey God's commandments. So, for example, if we see that there is a conflict between what we think about mamzerim, yes, this halachic category, which I don't want to explain now, or let's take women's issues, yes, about women who refuse to get a bill of divorce. Rabbis can say, we are trying to do our best, but our hands are tied. this is halacha, there is a conflict here, we know that the cases are very hard, and we understand you, but what can we do? This is God's commandment, and if you're a truly religious person, if you're a truly religious woman, you should obey halacha and not come with this vicious feminist critique. So obviously religious feminists cannot accept that as well. So religious feminists just need to understand what's going on in this regard with this theology, and what kind of theology we develop in order to respond to Akedah theology. The second obstacle that we see in the halachic or in the theological discourse, in the narrative, is the slippery slope argument, which I believe here I don't have to explain, but let's say that for Orthodox people, the worst scenario is that religious Orthodox communities will deteriorate into what's going on within the reform movement within Judaism, because according to Orthodox people, to live religious life according to the reform movement, it means to destroy religion, to destroy everything. So the fear here is that if we allow women, for example, to read from the Torah, although we can understand that it is not necessarily confronts halacha, yes, but if we will allow this, at the end, they won't pray with the mechitza, yes, or women and men are going to daven together, and this is what reformed the liberal movements within Judaism are doing, and this means the destruction of religion itself, or Judaism itself. And this is only, of course, one example, and we can give many examples how the slippery slope argument works here. The third obstacle, which is, I tend to believe, one of the dangerous one, is that of gender essentialism, which now actually flourish within the religious Zionist, especially within the religious Zionist circles. What does it mean? Essentialism, basically, I don't think that I have to explain it here, but like your nature as a woman actually dictates your position within the religious world and also within the regular secular world. What's the problem with essentialism? The problem is that it seems as if it goes hand with the Aristotelian principle of equality, because the equality principle, just make a long story short, the Aristotle principle says that equal treatment to the equals and different treatment to the different. So now the question is, what is the relevant difference between men and women? And if you can put a finger on a relevant difference, then you don't have to give it an equal treatment. Here is the problem, that when you say that the woman has a nature that because of that nature she is different from men, we can say that we are not against the equality principle, but that she is that the religious world actually treat her according to her nature, and this is not a discrimination. So this is a very sophisticated argument, the gender essentialism, and again, religious feminism need to know how to handle this. And nationalism, according to the rising of extremist nationalists, especially within the religious Zionist circles in Israel, it seems that women are being asked, or even it's a demand, yes, that since they seem as the builders of the nation, they have to submit their aspirations in order to build the nation. So that's why we called our lecture religious feminism against religious egoism, because one of the articles that we read actually blamed religious feminists of being egoists because they do not submit their aspiration for the sake of the nation. Like for the sake of the nation, they have to build families, strong families, to raise children, to build the home, which is the basic unit of society. And perhaps we'll see an example afterwards about nationalism. And of course, the fifth obstacle that we see in the theological discourse is the discourse about normal family values. And this is, of course, a discourse against the LGBTQ people and their families. I mean, I'm putting it under brackets because that's how the religious extremists see this. But I want to say that here, as Orit Avishai wrote in her wonderful book, there are so many changes that are going within modern Orthodox circles and religious Zionist circles in Israel. So this discourse of normal family values, I see it as less dangerous than the Akedah theology or gender essentialism. So I stop here.
Okay, so thank you, Ronit. We'll just say that we call this the illiberal backlash. We didn't get into it much now. Maybe later in the conversation we can. But we also draw on how these ideas, some of them are old, some of them can be found and based on earlier interpretations of Jewish texts, but they are definitely having a recurrence, and some of them are actually new or new formulations of them, and that the way that they act are specifically, as you can see in this picture, as shields against the feminist critique of Judaism and Orthodoxy. So their place in the rabbinic discourse have to do with trying to stop these feminist ideas from taking root and stop feminist norms and practices from becoming legitimate. And that part of what is happening is that these discourses are intertwined with the broader illiberal rise within the Israeli politics, and in many ways are very echo broader illiberal forces that are happening in other places in the world, and we get into the details of that in the book. The final chapter, which we're actually not really going to get into because then we would be here for several more hours, but is another major part of the book, says, okay, so we looked at all this this change from within the various forces and the various back and forth and both the achievements and the obstacles within the religious Zionist community. But of course, within the Israeli context, these things don't happen on their own. They're always in relationship with the broader Israeli democratic, liberal, complicated norms and narratives of Israel itself. And so often there are cases in which the feminists will turn to the state, particularly we look at the Supreme Court, and ask for the Supreme Court's intervention in order to help them enact the change that they want to see. And we analyze certain cases and we try to theorize how we understand one of the ways that the Supreme Court could take action or decide not to take action in ways that could be more productive for the religious Zionist movement to succeed and not face a backlash that would actually stop these seeds of change from taking root. And so if you want, we can answer more about that later in the Q&A, but we create two models. One is the narrative ripeness test, and the other one is the dignity test for more acute cases, and try to engage in these questions of multiculturalism and minorities within minorities, and how we view the judicial, the role of judicial institutions in being able to enable and not impede the change that feminists or women within these religious communities want to. So the final quote, and then we will open up to questions and to a conversation with Orit, is that hopefully what you got from this very brief overview is that it's not either or. It's not either religious or feminist. It's not either slow evolution or radical reform. And one of the ways that we've thought, it's not either culture or law. One of the ways that we really try to imagine this uses this image or this metaphor that Yoski Achituv, who was a leader of the religious kibbutzim movement, so he says this: religious revolutions don't usually happen by bursting through frameworks and existing structures and replacing them with others, right? A total revolution, throwing everything out and starting anew. But rather by emphasizing one value or a group of values from within the existing religious system and setting it at the top of the priority scale. And inevitably, as you shift, all the coordinates change and the existing traditional values shift in their position. So it's an internal shifting of what are the main values, what are the central values that guide us and that we navigate our lives according to and our culture according to. And as a result, the face of the religious and traditional system is completely transformed, even often so dramatically it becomes unrecognizable, right? So from one generation to the next, you suddenly see a huge change, despite the fact that it assumes the rhetoric of authenticity and ongoing continuity from Sinai. So it has this sense of continuity and this rhetoric of continuity, but actually also enables deep change to happen in ways that can be seen in this relationship between the norms and the narratives. So we're going to stop here. We've said a lot. Orit.
Thank you so much for that. That was very impressive how much you packed into your presentation. And I will just put a plug to the audience that absolutely there's a lot more to unpack in the book. And you can go to Brandeis University Press website and order the book. Okay, so I have a few questions for you, and audience, we are waiting for your questions to come in. So it's not just a conversation between me and the presenters, although I will channel your questions. So in chapter 2, and then in your discussion today of chapter 2, you outline many changes and shifts. But the interesting part of the story is that they don't align with they don't provide a linear story of progress. So what more can you tell us about mechanisms of change that led to Orthodox feminist movement successes? How do they relate to this idea of the relationship or interaction between nomos and narrative? And what can you tell us more about this idea of tempered radicalism? And so scholars for decades, right, are trying to to pinpoint what do we call this sort of animal that's sort of feminist, but not radical feminist, and grows within conservative religious traditions. So on any of these points, I'd love to hear more.
So perhaps I'll start reacting to this, to your question, Uri. I know that radicalism is very sexy. People really want to believe that only while doing something really radical, they're going to change the world. When I was young, I also believed in that. But I truly and honestly believe that not only within conservative societies like the religious society, of course, but also in the world in general, changes take time, they have a pace of their own, and radicalism should be in the insistence and the stubbornness to do the change, yes, but the change itself, I believe, is a more evolution rather than a revolution. And to paraphrase Audre Lorde that Tanya just quoted before, she said that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. First of all, I don't want to dismantle the master's house. This is my house as well. Yes, I'm a religious person. This identity is very important to me. I understand that there are many, many problems within this house, especially in this regard, what we're speaking now about women, yes? And I want to change it, but I don't want to dismantle the house. So I think it's better to say only the master's tools will change the master's house. So only when women got control over the master's tools, especially within the study hall, when they know, when I finished high school, I didn't know how to open the Talmud. I didn't know. I didn't learn. It was forbidden for women to learn Talmud. So every, 10-year-old boy could tell me, you're wrong. That's what is written there. And I didn't know how to approach at all the Jewish library. Thank God later on I learned a lot, but the first thing is to gain control over knowledge, over religious knowledge. And when you gain control over this, then you can start moving the process and getting control over the tools. Actually, you can make the change. So I don't believe in this messianism I think it's a false messianism that we need to do everything right now exactly as we want. We won't compromise on everything. And I see, as far as I see, the religious feminist movement in Israel is one of the most successful movements in Israel, even within the feminist movement, the larger feminist movement in Israel. We have so many successful achievements. So the pace, the going hand with hand, not so quickly, not to rush, to give the Orthodox community the chance to digest all the changes that we want to do. I think it proves itself. However, I know it's not as strong or as quickly as I wanted, even myself, as I wanted it to be. But it's better like this than to make radical things, but they won't stay. They will make really even a more strong backlash, or people just feel that they won't belong to these ideas, those crazy ideas of those crazy feminists. So when it's slowly but surely, I think the reality actually proves it, it's better and it's much more radical doing this in this way than a revolution.
So I want to add one more thing. I think there are two things that are counterintuitive that we found, that we show in multiple examples. So I won't give a specific example. I'll just sort of explain the pattern. I think that one of the things that we could show, that we show it in the book, is that sometimes changing the narrative is really the key. Meaning, when people start imagining things differently, then that becomes something that they can speak about, something that they can imagine themselves as doing without assuming that that breaks the mold and they must be, they've gone too far. And that when those reimagined opportunities and possibilities become strong enough, then when actions are taken and norms come to embody those values, they're no longer questioned. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes even before the values and the narratives are there, someone will say, no, let's just try it. Let's just practice in a different way. And then something that seemed out there becomes normalized. And we show it in the book how many things that seemed initially radical moved towards the mainstream. And I say this because I think that based on your question, it really isn't so clear. Should you start by changing the narrative, or should you start by changing the norms? These aren't two separate things. They interact, and there's interplay. And then certain local struggles, one way started and then other things developed and the other way around. But then in all the cases that we showed, no small local change stayed just what it was. There was always ways in which it resonated and affected other changes in other fields, in other contexts. And then when you take the historical perspective, and neither of us is a historian, but even in a short span of time, when you do zoom out, suddenly it looks like real revolution. and the things that were unimaginable have become not only imaginable, but have become something that even the more right-wing conservative parts of religious Zionism have taken ownership over and can't imagine otherwise. Right. I think that one of the most powerful examples of that is in the afterword, we mention how even Orit, who I think she and I agree about nothing. She's, one of the most, I'll say it here, it's okay that it's recorded, really religious extremist,
right-wing extremist.
Right-wing extremist, religious, and I could say worse things. Maybe I won't say them now. She was at the rabbinic ordination of, I think it was her daughter-in-law, and she wrote this. She wrote this proud post about how here was her daughter-in-law studying Torah, and there's no connection in her mind between this being a feminist outcome of this feminist revolution, but it has become part of something that she can't imagine religious life without that. So I think that this works in surprising ways.
Yeah, but I just want to add to this that it's not always going so smoothly. Just if to speak personally, just for example, when we did bat mitzvah, to my daughter, and we pray in a partnership minyan, which is much more egalitarian than the usual Orthodox synagogue. My father, meaning her grandfather, my daughter's grandfather, didn't come. He didn't come to her bat mitzvah because he thought that this is actually the destruction of Judaism. So even going, step by step, slowly but surely, as I described before, it has some heavy costs. Sometimes it has heavy costs, but I think it's worthwhile.
Thank you for that. So an observation and some feedback, and then an audience question here. One of the things that I really picked up from your answer is this idea of dismantling versus changing the master's house. And Ronit, you impassionately said, I don't want to break it down. It's my house too, right? Which really raises these really deep questions, right? About ownership, about authority, right? So that that's part of the process. The other thing is, right, often when we think about these kinds of movements and the backlash to them, you think, well, it's strategic, right? They're like, yeah, if we go too far, if we go too fast, it might come back to haunt us. But you're describing a much more intentional, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a much more dynamic kind of unfolding process. So that's really interesting. Just to say that we have an audience note here that thanking you for the personal experiences that sort of really brings to life what you're talking about. And a question from the audience, do you think that women will ever be counted towards an Orthodox minyan? And if so, how long would this take? Building on what you've just told us. So
I don't know if that's a question, because it's already happening.
okay.
Meaning there are places, there are communities where that is already happening. And then the more interesting sociological question is, in what sense are they still considered Orthodox, right? So we get into these definitions, and we get again into the conversation with the slippery slope, and who gets to determine, and does this even matter? Who gets to define whom, in what ways? But the changes in that sense, both in terms of rabbinic ordination and in terms of women being counted. And again, I don't want to seem, it's not just a one-sided progress moving forward. We've left it all. There's definitely a lot of back and forth, and there's definitely a lot of areas, and we talk about it also in the book, areas which have been forgotten or left behind, right? Certain populations, certain areas of religious life that have also been left behind, and certain women that haven't gotten all the chances for this kind of reform that has happened. So we need to be aware of that too.
Yeah, we are optimistic, but it will take time until it become, more common among modern Orthodox communities. It will take time. But as my mentor and Rebbetzin, Professor Tamar Ross, used to say, the train left the station. All what the rabbis can do is to throw stones and shout Shabbos, Shabbos. That's all. But the train left the station.
That's great. And so building on what you've just said, we have a question from Josh Shanes, who's asking, to what extent are these feminists committed to the label Orthodox, or, I would add, it's Israeli variant, or as opposed to halachic or some other label, because we do know that these labels are meaningful.
That's a very good question. Orthodoxy is an ideology. A conservative no, with capital C, of course, a conservative ideology, which actually trying to block almost every change that the religious life or life in itself, want to do. I myself prefer the word halachic commitment, halachic feminism, and not Orthodox feminism, because I'm not committed to this conservative ideology. What I do commit as a halachic feminist is to make changes within or through the halachic tools, through the legitimate halachic tools that were developed during a generation. But Orthodoxy, it's a problem. Sociology speaking, and Tanya is much more expert in this, but sociology speaking, I belong to what we call an Orthodox community, a modern Orthodox community, and I want to belong to this community for several reasons, which I don't think we have the option to speak about now. But theologically, Orthodoxy is a conservative movement that actually, I'm not sure now is doing the best for the preserving of Judaism in the modern era.
Wow, that's quite a statement, right? Because that's exactly what they claim to do, and the shields that you had up there kind of were a visual representation of that. So you've been working on this for as long as I've known you, I think, right? For a decade. And many things have changed during this time. The increasing of power of illiberal forces, which Tanya kept telling us that she might expand on. Their entry into literal seats of power in the current government, but even previously, battle over the judicial system, and of course, October 7th and the aftermath. So how do these changes in Israel's sociopolitical reality affect the argument that you make in the book? And, and how did you follow these and untangle the threads as you were following them in real time? And so this is especially in chapter 4, where you discuss the legal struggles of religious feminism, and especially in light of the current weakening of the judicial system. And this is top news in the past few days again, and this resistance to more liberal approaches to the law and to the making of the law. So anything you can expand on?
So this is a long answer that I don't know if we have all the answers to yet, because this is the question that we were left with as we were wrapping up the book and since it was published. I'll start sort of thinking it through, and in a sense I want to connect it to the previous question about orthodoxy and halakha. I think that is very clear. Anyone who is studying orthodoxy today in its multiple variations, whether in Israel or in other places, knows that it is not one thing, and that especially within the religious Zionist context, it is no longer clear that there is one community, or that this sector, as Israelis call it, is really all tied together. And I think that I am not sure that in a few years, regardless of how this current the struggles today, the security struggles, but also the struggles around the judicial overhaul, how they will play out. Regardless of that, this community is already has more rifts than common denominators. And one of the rifts has to do with to what extent is feminism, not feminism as an ideology or as an outward, I will hold up the flag and call myself a feminist, but feminism in terms of really the sensibilities and the basic norms and values that have already been incorporated for some parts of this community, that and the sense of also liberal values that are embedded in this kind of understanding of what feminism and gender equality is, are already part of those. They've already become deeply incorporated in what it means to be a religious Zionist for some of these people. We can see that in terms of rabbinic organizations that have men and women, and they serve together, and it's not even problematized. It doesn't even have to be explained anymore. It's just obvious, right? And then other parts where I think that they're the backlash is really, really strong and has the question of gender essentialism, the question of nationalism over personal moral choices and autonomy and personal rights, that has, and the educational system, which has gone more to the right within the religious Zionist world and is pushing people more towards those directions. So answering the question of how this backlash and how these liberal forces will meet or confront this change, really it depends on who we're talking about and which of those voices within religious Zionism will end up being stronger, and will there be also some voices that will be pushed out of that that category, moved into a different kind of I don't even know what the sociological language will be when we get there. So that's one thing that was already happening, and it was important for me to say that because that was already happening even before this current government and even before this current. But certainly the very vocal, very intentional populist, right-wing, nationalist, illiberal forces that have power today in Israel and are one by one dismantling women's rights, not just religious women's rights, just women's rights in general, and are attacking and weakening the judicial system, which our whole fourth chapter is based on this assumption, which I think, Americans will know this very well. There was an assumption that the Supreme Court, while it has many different, opinions, it also is very much based in liberal values and commitment to liberal legacies. And that is no longer obvious anymore, right? And so, and the fact that we thought when we were writing the book, we really thought about the religious community as a community that has a lot of political power, but it is not the majority. And today, those small parties they're still not the majority, but they have more political power in there. So I think that that we do have to take into account that this has all changed. And that the positive take on that is that the stronger the backlash, the more we can understand that the critique was taking hold, that the critique was making change, and therefore the backlash had to become so strong. Therefore, suddenly we had to say things that before were obvious. Suddenly we have to fight for saying that what you're doing is not legitimate, because people started thinking, oh, maybe it is legitimate, right? So that's the positive take on it. The negative take on it is that when I want to say violent, because these ways they're not being done in democratic ways, right? They're really using power and force and not taking into account other people's needs and other people's rights. So when force when power is being taken like this by force to take this kind of, it's not a deliberate, what kind of really, how the social movement from below can continue in the way that it will. It will have to in some way take a hit and possibly go underground, possibly be more focused on what seems most important at that moment and most urgent, and putting aside some other issues. It's hard to tell, right? But the whole relationship with the institutions is going to look different.
Yeah, but I just want to add just 1 minute. I want to add to this. I agree with everything, but just to say that I think both of us are still committed to the basic idea of chapter 4, which is the ripeness test. Yes, we believe that when the narrative is ripened within the religious society, then judicial, then the court can intervene, meaning that the most important work of religious feminism or feminists in general is to change the narrative. And changing the narrative is not only to fight with the courts on our side, because it's not guaranteed anymore, but to fight for our ideas, giving lectures, lessons, speaking with each other, doing things differently in a more equal way. So when and by this changing the narrative, people are, as Yoske Achituv, when we quoted it at the end of the lecture, said, all the coordinates changes, and people now think that, of course, God wants us to be equal. He created us in his image, yes? And so basic feminist statements are seen like God's revelation. That's the goal, that people would think like that. And in order to achieve this, we have to ripen the narrative within the religious society.
I just want to say one more thing. I think that one of the it's almost, we don't even, I don't even think we bother saying it directly in the book, right? But it's one of the underlying understandings from the book, and I think it answers this question of like, where are we going next? How will this change now that these very liberal forces are taking hold? I think it is no longer possible, given what we describe in the book and given religious Zionist feminism and everything that has happened so far, both the successes and the places that are yet to succeed. It is no longer possible to speak in the name of Judaism or Orthodoxy and assume that you are speaking about only one thing, meaning the critical voices from within and the plurality and diversity of voices from within have taken hold and have a voice and have representation and have their own institutions and have educational institutions that cannot easily be hidden away. And it is much harder for certain, right? So in the Haredi world, that's another, it's the parallel. There it is still much easier for the hegemonic powers that be to speak for the community. And I think within religious Zionism, the plurality and the diversity has already, it is already clear that even those who speak for religious Zionism, like the party, Hatzionut Hadatit, really only speak for certain forces within it. And in that sense, even if the illiberal forces continue to say, like, this is our version of Judaism, and this is why we think that this is how the whole state should be run, it's no longer believable because there are too many other voices saying, no, we believe Judaism, Orthodoxy should look differently. And the questions of gender, and this is something that really can't be said enough, the questions of gender are at the heart of the illiberal war, okay? It really is, around the world, not just in Israel. Questions of gender, of family, of sexuality, of whether, I mean, here was Trump, right? Whether there is such a thing, gender, and whether we can think of that as something that there might be more than a binary. And so these questions are not on the side, marginal, and maybe one day we'll come back to it because now we're dealing with a different kind of fight. The language, the discourse, and the norms and the practices and the policies they're putting in place really have to do with this question of gender. And so I think that that in that sense, the book is not predictive, but it could help us understand how change can continue to happen and how to analyze the kind of backlash and make sense of it, so that we also know maybe how to defend ourselves from it or create and work in different ways that won't fall into these pits.
And one of the tools of change, it's really very important for me to say that, one of the tools for change is hope and optimism, because it's very easy to sink to pessimism, especially in the current regime in Israel, perhaps even in the United States. I don't know what do you feel about that. But I always, and again, I'm coming here from my personal story, from my family. I always tell myself that my grandmothers who were born in Afghanistan and didn't know how to read and write until they passed away, yes, 100 years later, the situation is so different that their granddaughter is also already a professor at the university. So we shouldn't forget that we gained so much already, and we are not going to give up. And we should remember that.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, we're having this conversation now in the context of a new regime here. And I won't say much more about that, but sort of this concern about the rise of the illiberal forces is right, absolutely not just a local case. And I think this is where one of the major contributions of the book, and I will put another plug for it. I can't remember what is it, beginning of chapter 4, where you have about a 3-4 page summary of illiberalism. That is priceless. So
Chapter 3.
Yes, so that, thank you. We have a few more questions in the chat, and now I know we're not going to get to all of them. There's a question here from Chaya Juni about asking if there's an Israeli equivalent to demagogues in North America who attempt to still control the only acceptable narrative by saying things like open orthodoxy is not orthodoxy. Or is in Israel is the affiliation a little more rigid and therefore you can't necessarily say that. You know, so what do you have to say about sort of, again, it's the question of labeling.
Why listening to them? So they say, okay.
Okay. Is that the, okay.
Just keep continue what you're believing in. That's the most important thing.
Okay. Josh is asking here, and we are not going to do justice to this question in the time remaining, which is under 10 minutes. But sort of asking if sort of, you know, there's this narrative that, you know, religious Zionism is kind of, you know, tearing apart at the seams, a breakdown, et cetera. But on the other hand, there are some who claim that there are some agreements within, so more ideological than theological or religious, right? Or about observance around nationalist values. So what can you tell us about this question about the ethno-national and the religious based on the case that you have looked at? And there's a lot to unpack there. So I will preface, audience, that is a whole different conversation, and they will not be able to get to everything in the time remaining. But if anything that you can shed light on would be, I think, appreciated here.
I'll say very briefly, I mean, first of all, I agree. I think that's a whole nother, it's worthy of its own research, and it's changing a lot now. I don't think that I'm making it clear that we are not claiming in any way that this is the lefties and the people on the right. That's not in the Israeli sense. That's not what we're talking about. The religious Zionism, and we purposely call it religious Zionism and not just modern Orthodoxy, because it is entangled within nationalism and within a certain understanding of what it means to be a Jewish and democratic state, and within collective values and within a very strong commitment to militarism. That is clear. However, I think that the understanding that nationalism requires to put aside the individual rights, to put aside liberal commitments, and let nationalism and collectivism take over, specifically within the context of women, saying, as Ronit said earlier in the example, right, your main goal must be to raise children and to raise children to become soldiers, and you should be happy with that, and there is no real deep legitimacy for you to say that you want a deep religious life or you want to pursue a career, right? That is not obvious to everyone. That is what's at question, right? So it's not, are we part of the Zionist national project? Do we support relatively more right-wing stances? Yes, that is true. It's you know, you can prove that with the surveys. but that is not saying that everyone within this group is willing to take nationalism as the ultimate and priority, that for that you are then going to subsume everything else and all individual rights. And I think that in that sense, we can already see within the book, we see the different discourses and we see the different groups sort of vying with each other. What that means about the broader security questions and ethno-nationalism and Palestinians and peaceful resolutions, it's something we don't get to into the book. I think that it's worthy of more serious research. And I think it's probably too early right now to know. Things are much more complicated than we can get into just within this narrow prism of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Any quick closing thoughts? We are almost at time.
Well, I spoke about optimism and hope. I think hope is actually a resource for activism. Without optimism, without hope, I think feminists in general and religious feminists in particular, because they have much more obstacles, I believe, we could not do what we're trying to do. So we cannot lose hope. And here I want to say what I termed earlier as a false messianism, like radicalism, as I termed before, is a false messianism. Hope is the kind of messianism, the idea of messianism, that that we can imagine a different future and a better future, and we can imagine gender justice actually happening within our communities. If we can imagine that, we can do that. And I think we should not give up on this resource for our activism, or for religious feminist activism. And I think the book, one of his messages is this, and this is very important to emphasize at the end of our talk.
Yeah, I think that if I'm less hopeful these days about the institutions, about how strong the institutions are, and how many attacks and brutal sort of undermining they can withstand, and whether they will serve the good of the public. And I'm less hopeful about the institutions these days. I think that I am more hopeful about the people on the ground than I was before. And in that sense, we also end the book with a call for paying attention to the education of the next generation, particularly of the boys. As mothers of both boys and girls, really saying, like, if we want these changes to be to really be inculcated and really grow and be able to continue, then it comes down to the education of boys and girls who grow up in the world in which this is no longer a question, right? Gender equity is this is their mother's milk. So if we can reach that, then we know that they will continue to put up the good fight for the next years to come as well.
I have 5 children, 4 of them are boys, and I'm also a grandmother already, and I see how they build their families, and I can say that I'm even more optimistic.
Well, leaving us with optimism is good. We need that, it seems, on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you so much on behalf of the Center for Jewish Studies at Fordham and the Haredi Research Group. Thank you so much for your work, for your activism, for your optimism in the face of the world we live in. Thank you so much to our audience and to our sponsors, and come back to future events. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you.